Here to dig into the potential impact of this deal is former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen. Welcome back to Power Play.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be back.
As many people know, you were appointed by then President Joe Biden, and those tariffs on Chinese EVs were applied by Canada to basically match the Biden administration. Today, the U.S. Trade Representative said that Canada's decision was, quote, problematic, as we heard in that quote. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think the right way to look at this, and your prior panel, I think, really covered this well. Trade policy is a matter of balance. It's not a matter of extremes. And you can't take, when we're on news shows and we're in social media, you get single sentence sound bites, which are more absolute and more extreme than the reality of making intelligent trade policy. So diversifying Canada's trade away from the United States is a worthy goal. But it is not easy to do, and you're not going to do it in one bite or even in a handful of bites. This deal, having conversations with China, making trade deals with China, notwithstanding what the trade representative said, as President Trump said, is a smart thing to do, and it is a good thing to do, so long as Canada is protecting its interests in making these deals. And these are two, the EV deal is a small deal. It's 49,000 vehicles, which, as the last panel pointed out, is a very small percentage of the Canadian automobile market, 2.5% of the Canadian automobile market. No one's losing jobs. The world isn't turning over a deal that's going to let 49,000 low-cost Chinese EVs into the Canadian market, representing literally 2.5% of the Canadian automobile market. Canola is a major problem for Canada. And remember, the canola industry is twice as large as the automobile industry in Canada in terms of employment, in terms of revenue, in terms of GDP impact. Getting out from under the Chinese tariffs on canola had to be a huge and significant priority for Prime Minister Carney. And so that's what he went to China and tried to do. I'll also note, by the way, and I think this was pointed out in the last panel as well, that we're all operating off of press announcements essentially from the Canadian side. We don't even have a press announcement from the Chinese side. We don't have fully negotiated deals. And as I understand the press announcement, the expectation is that by May 1st, China will be reducing its tariffs on canola. Even the deal is a future-sounding deal. So there's a lot more work to be done, but it's a positive. You almost can't look at this and say that this is not a good day for Canada trade. It's tricky dealing with China because of China's human rights issues and of doing business with China. So you have to be careful. But that's always been the United States philosophy on doing deals with China, that tread carefully, make sure you're protecting United States interests, don't go overboard. And that's what this conversation seems to be.
But to that end, I wanted to know, if you were still ambassador here in Canada, what would your advice been to the Canadian government when it comes to making a deal with China to make sure not only that Canadian interests are protected, but also North American interests are protected, so that this doesn't have some sort of blowback south of the border for the country, for Canada?
Well, I think my major advice would have been, and I wouldn't have had to give advice because I would have been there and I would have been a part of conversations, but just to make sure that the United States understood what the goals were as Prime Minister Carney was going to China. And for all I know, for all you know, those conversations did take place, which may be one of the reasons for the muted reactions by President Trump. So I'm a believer in the no surprises among friends rule. And if you're going to go and try and make these deals, and they're measured deals, they don't turn the world upside down, by the way, they are similar. The automobile deal is similar to the deal that President Trump has talked about making with China. So that if this doesn't come out of the blue to the United States, it's a measured response. China is the second largest economy in the world. And when I was ambassador, I said, you can't just have a policy that says, we're going to ignore China. We're going to do nothing with China. That doesn't work for the second largest economy in the world. You have to be prepared to do measured deals that protect United States or Canadian interests and or North American interests. And at least from the initial read, it seems to me that that's what Prime Minister Carney did in these couple of deals, and protecting, by the way, a uniquely Canadian asset, which is its canola trade. That deal doesn't have an adverse impact on the United States. The United States isn't in the canola business, but it has an incredible positive impact on Canada, and in particular in the prairie provinces. And as I said, the adverse impact of the Chinese canola tariffs was an incredibly significant problem for Canada as a country. And to really be able to take that on, and at the price of only allowing 49,000 electric vehicles manufactured in China, low cost electric vehicles from China into the Canadian market, representing, less than 3% of the Canadian automobile industry and an even smaller percentage of the North American automobile industry, seems to me like pretty intelligent and smart deal making.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.